Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the hate map, you don't like it. I get it. But the SPLC is not a government organization, and we have the First Amendment. So they're free to put what they want, and you, all of you, are free to speak out against it and to explain why they're wrong. But as I think of my Republican colleagues, we believe in the First Amendment, except, I guess, when it's critical of far-right groups or conservative groups who support these Republicans. But you are not free to use the government to criminally indict an organization based on a completely bogus charge. And I want to dig into this indictment. On April 21st, hours after Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche and the FBI Director Kash Patel announced this indictment, Mr. Blanche went on Fox and said this.
No information that we have that suggests that the money that they were paying to these informants and these members of these organizations, they then turned around and shared what they learned with law enforcement. To the contrary, or else we would have known from their own words that they had given this money to these guys, and we didn't know it.
So, they had no idea that the SPLC was using informants and providing information to the government. 5 days later, Mr. Blanche was forced to acknowledge that that was a false statement. In fact, it was in a document filed by the Department of Justice where he said it is true, he went on TV and said it is true that over the years they have selectively shared information with law enforcement. That's well documented and no dispute. But they aren't charged with any of that conduct. What the hell does that mean, they aren't charged with any of that conduct? The entire premise of this fraud scheme is that SPLC was actually using the money given by the donors to support the hate groups, not to dismantle them as they represented. So any knowledge by the government that the SPLC shared information with them to dismantle these groups completely undermines and defeats the fraud claim. But there's plenty of evidence that the FBI knew that the information provided to them by the SPLC to help the FBI dismantle these groups came from informants. In fact, 2 weeks before the indictment, the SPLC presented the U.S. Attorney's Office with evidence that showed that they had been sharing information from informants with the FBI dating back to 2018. And even Blanche's statement that none of the information shared with the FBI was charged in the indictment is false. It doesn't matter because that's not what the fraud claim is, but it is false because the Charlottesville Unite the Right movement is specifically mentioned in the indictment. But the indictment does not mention the 45-page report that the SPLC sent to multiple FBI offices before the Unite the Right event that included information from their informants. Now, we've established that. Now we know this fraud claim is completely bogus. But it gets worse because it's not even part of the allegations. In paragraph 19 of the indictment, it explains the fraud scheme. It says that the SPLC represented to the victim donors that their money would be used to help dismantle violent extremist groups, but that they did not tell those donors exactly how they would do that. So it actually charges fraud by omission, not misrepresentation. But in order to have fraud by omission, you must prove that the omission was material to the victims such that they would have acted differently if they had known about it. But there isn't a single allegation in the indictment that any donor would not have donated if they knew about the payments to informants. In fact, everything we know is the opposite. Ms. Wiley has pointed out repeatedly about how donors are trying to continue to give. And that Intercept article that Ranking Member Raskin introduced cites 20 donors who now say that they either knew about the paid informants or they would have made their donations anyway. And so what is this really about? It is weaponizing and politicizing the Department of Justice, not any of your groups, to quash and squash free speech, to muzzle people that because you are trying to protect far-right investigations who are huge supporters of the Republican Party. They may not do any oversight over this indictment, but I guarantee you when we take the majority back in January, we will be doing that oversight and they will be held accountable. I yield back.
What you just watched is not a political speech. It is a legal brief delivered from a congressional dais, and the congressman who delivered it came with a timeline, a document number, a paragraph citation, and a Fox News clip. That combination is not accidental. It is the method of someone who understands that a congressional statement is not an argument. It is a record. And what this congressman put into the record about the SPLC indictment is now there permanently, whether the Department of Justice responds to it or not. Start with the Fox News clip. On April 21st, hours after Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche and FBI Director Kash Patel announced the indictment of the Southern Poverty Law Center, Blanche went on television and said the department had no information suggesting that the money the SPLC paid to informants was then shared with law enforcement. He said if they had known that, they would have known from the SPLC's own words, and they did not know it. 5 days later, Blanche filed a document with the Department of Justice acknowledging that statement was false. He said it is true that over the years the SPLC had selectively shared information with law enforcement, that it was well documented, and that there was no dispute about it. He then said they are not charged with any of that conduct. The congressman read both statements into the record in sequence. The April 21st statement, the correction 5 days later, and then he asked the question that the rest of his statement was built to answer. What the hell does that mean? They are not charged with any of that conduct. Read that question carefully. It is not rhetorical. It is legal. The congressman is making a specific argument about the structure of the fraud claim underlying the indictment, and the argument is precise enough to follow without a law degree. The indictment's theory is this: the SPLC represented to its donors that their money would be used to dismantle violent extremist groups, while actually paying informants embedded in those groups. The fraud claim, as the congressman frames it, rests on the premise that the SPLC was taking donor money and funneling it to the groups it claimed to be fighting, rather than using those payments as an intelligence-gathering mechanism designed to help law enforcement destroy those groups from the inside. The congressman's argument is that Blanche's own corrective statement, that the SPLC had in fact been sharing information from those informants with the FBI, dating back to 2018, and that this was well documented, collapses the fraud theory. If the SPLC was paying informants and sharing what those informants learned with the FBI to help dismantle violent extremist groups, then the money was being used for exactly the purpose the donors were told it would serve. The mechanism was different from what donors may have imagined, but the outcome, dismantling violent extremist groups, was precisely what was represented. That is the congressman's legal argument. It is specific, it is documented, and it is now in the official transcript of a congressional hearing. He then went further. He said 2 weeks before the indictment was filed, the SPLC presented the U.S. Attorney's Office with evidence showing that they had been sharing information from informants with the FBI since 2018. He said that information was in the department's possession before the indictment was announced. He said the FBI knew that the information shared with it by the SPLC, including information used to monitor the Charlottesville Unite the Right movement, came from paid informants. He then made a specific citation, paragraph 19 of the indictment. He said that paragraph describes the fraud scheme as the SPLC representing that donor money would be used to help dismantle violent extremist groups without telling donors exactly how they would do that. He characterized that as fraud by omission rather than fraud by misrepresentation. And he stated the legal standard for fraud by omission: the omission must be material to the victims, meaning the victims would have acted differently if they had known the omitted fact. Then he made the argument that is the sharpest legal point in the entire statement. There is not a single allegation in the indictment that any donor would have withheld their donation if they had known the SPLC used paid informants. He said the evidence runs the other direction. He cited an Intercept article entered into the record by the ranking member, describing 20 donors who either knew about the paid informants or said they would have donated anyway. He noted that donors are actively trying to continue giving to the SPLC after the indictment. If no donor would have acted differently upon learning that the SPLC used paid informants, the omission is not material. And if the omission is not material, the fraud by omission theory fails on its own terms. That argument is now in the official transcript of a congressional hearing. The paragraph citation is there, the legal standard is there, the donors are named as evidence, the materiality gap is on the record. The congressman closed by saying what he believes the indictment is really about. He said it is about weaponizing and politicizing the Department of Justice, not against any of the groups named in the hate map, but to quash free speech, to muzzle an organization that investigates far-right groups that are major supporters of the Republican Party. He said when his party takes the majority, there will be oversight and there will be accountability. Two things can be true at the same time. The Department of Justice has the authority to indict any organization it believes has committed fraud against its donors, regardless of that organization's political orientation or its history of cooperation with law enforcement. The question of whether the SPLC's use of paid informants was adequately disclosed to donors is a legitimate legal question that a court, not a congressional statement, will ultimately resolve. Blanche's corrected statement that the SPLC shared informant information with law enforcement but is not charged with that conduct may reflect a legally coherent distinction between the organization's intelligence gathering activity and a separate pattern of conduct the department believes constitutes donor fraud. And the 20 donors cited by the congressman represent a small fraction of the SPLC's total donor base. The views of 20 donors on materiality do not establish that no donor would have acted differently. Both of those are reasonable positions. What the congressman was asking, however, was not whether the department has the authority to bring the indictment. He was asking whether the indictment survives its own legal theory once Blanche's corrective statement is placed next to it. And the corrective statement is now in the record alongside the indictment's paragraph 19, alongside the materiality argument, alongside the evidence of pre-indictment disclosure to the U.S. Attorney's Office, alongside the 20 donors. The most precise instrument in the statement is not the Fox News clip. It is the sequence. The congressman did not argue that the SPLC is innocent. He argued that the government's own corrected account of what it knew when it knew it and what it did with that knowledge undermines the legal theory the government is using to prosecute the organization. That is a different argument. It is a narrower argument. And it is the kind of argument that is harder to dismiss than a general accusation of political motivation. So here is where this exchange leaves us, and it is genuinely two-sided. Was this congressman conducting legitimate legal oversight, identifying a documented gap between the government's public statements, its corrective filings, and the legal standard the indictment's own theory requires? Or was he delivering a legal-sounding defense of a political ally, using paragraph citations to dress up a partisan argument about which organizations the department should investigate? Was the SPLC indictment a legitimate fraud case that will be decided on evidence in a federal court, not a congressional hearing room? Or was it a politically motivated prosecution of an organization that provided documented intelligence to federal law enforcement for years, indicted using a fraud theory that fails on materiality before the first trial date is set? Two different stories. Same hearing, same official record. Tell me in the comments which version you walked away believing.
If you stayed this long, subscribe. The indictment is still active. The oversight promise is on the record. The transcript is waiting for both.